What makes someone a balanced leader? Hey there, this is your friend and guide, Caroline. On today's Balanced Leader, my incredible guest and I share strategies to help you lead with confidence, stay resilient, and avoid burnout. This isn't just about leadership, it's about thriving holistically in mind, body, and spirit. Ready to recalibrate? Well, let's dive in and create the balanced life you deserve. Welcome to today's episode of today's Balanced Leader. I am excited to have Kyira Wackett with me today. She is a licensed mental health therapist who specializes in shame resilience and radical acceptance through her platform called Adversity Rising. She empowers individuals with the insight, confidence, and skills to take charge of their own narratives. From personalized coaching to corporate wellness, Kyira champions the anti-Band-Aid movement, which we're going to have to talk about, advocating for meaningful and lasting change over quick fixes. At the heart of her approach lies That Life/AR. It's a renowned 5-step therapeutic program that Kyira offers in the spring and fall. And through her introspection and actionable strategies, Kyira guides participants towards navigating life's challenges with grace and resilience. With Kyira Wackett by your side, you're not just rewriting your story, you're reclaiming your narrative, embracing adversity, and charting a course towards profound fulfillment. Kyira, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I've been so excited and looking forward to this.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. And my listeners know that I always chat with my guests ahead of time. Super excited about what we're going to talk about today because we talked a lot about your story. We've talked a lot about COVID and kind of the impacts of that. But let's start off with just having you share a little bit about your story and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, I think every day the way that we would tell our story changes based on the context of our life right now. But one of the things that I think I've been really thinking a lot about and kind of as I rewrite those early parts of my life is that, like so many of us, I grew up holding space for and trying to manage everyone else's needs, wants, asks, requests. I think that many of us are sort of naturally empathic, but this idea of it feels good to take care of people. It feels good to do all the things. And I was only child. I had a single mom. At the time, I didn't know that my mom was struggling with a pretty severe and persistent mental health disorder and subsequently relapsed with some very serious drug use issues. And a lot of this was a story that I didn't find out until quite later. She had struggled before I was born as well. And I didn't know that kind of my natural propensity to take care of things meshed in really well with someone's inability to take care of and regulate their own mental health needs. And so I became what we know now as more of that parentified child. I was really taking care of my mom, taking care of a lot of other caregivers, managing things for people. And I think that there was a part of me that became both addicted to it, but also I needed that to be my identity because it felt like then I stood out. I had worth, I had value. People saw me as someone who could take care of everything. I was achieving at a really high rate. This is where we'll connect into the Band-Aid movement later on. But this idea of I need to be the best in order to just be good enough to be in the room with everyone else. And I think that really became my message as a kid of I have to take care of everyone. I have to be able to handle everything. I have to be the person that everyone can count on, not because I think I'm better than anyone else, but because it feels like if I don't do that, I can't be in the same room with everyone else. And so things that many of us go through in middle school and high school, going into college or in the workforce, whatever that is, as we're going through these different parts of identity, it felt like I just went deeper and deeper down that hole of I have to perform at a level of perfection to be good enough. And so I really found things that I just clutched into. I was going to be a doctor. I started dating somebody when I was a sophomore in high school. And I'm like, I'm going to marry this person. I'm going to have the white picket fence. Everything is going to look this way. And I was trying to curate an image of a life that I thought I had to have to be okay. And I think if any of us, whether it was an extreme version or not, are honest, it's what a lot of us do when we're younger. We're just trying to figure out how to fit in. And so we start to try to curate an image to the world around us so that we are accepted. And we confuse acceptance and conformity with belonging and a security in our sense of self and a security with the world around us. And so I could feel that tension between the reality of my life. When I was in high school, my mom was in prison. I was on free lunch. I was living with my grandma. I didn't want anyone to know any of those things. I wanted them to still perceive me a certain way. And I knew it kind of felt like these dark secrets that I could just keep hiding behind the perfection walls. When I was around 22, that just started to crumble. There was a myriad of factors that were happening. I was applying for medical schools, hating it. I had hated the majority of my college experience because I was in a relationship still with this person that I was unhappy with, pursuing a career I didn't want, pretending I was okay, never needing anyone. And I just kind of imploded. And there were some circumstances I think that really triggered that, but a lot of it I think was just the timing ended up being right, where everything I had been trying to run from smacked me in the face. And I had to come to terms with the fact that I had created a world where I was so far from any connection to myself that I couldn't even answer the question, who am I and what do I want? And I see this now with clients all the time. I think this is such a normal experience that we go through. And so I took years. I went to therapy. I did a lot of introspective work, tried on different careers, and I had some privilege, obviously, in that I could figure out how to do that and to be secure and be okay. But what came out of a lot of that was realizing that what I needed to do and then what I subsequently wanted to do for other people was to figure out how to feel okay in and with me and then helping other people figure out what that looked like. And that was really where I became familiar with the term shame, which is the fear of not belonging, the fear of not being good enough. And it is a fear or an emotional reaction to a belief at our core that we are inherently broken and unworthy. And so getting clear on that and realizing, oh my goodness, I've been feeling this way since I was a kid. I've been feeling like my job is to take care of my mom so she can be there for me. And when I can't do it good enough, the problem's me, not her addiction, or not if somebody is upset and we get in a fight, it's got to be me. I have to fix it. And so, really undoing some of those pieces to learn what's actually my responsibility, what's not, where do I have to heal. And once I did started my process, because I think, you talk about this too, and you've had guests that have talked about this where we're never done. The work is never over. It's an iterative process. But once I felt like I had done enough work that I could step into a space to really support other people is when I made the decision I wanted to go into therapy and to become a therapist, to work with people in that capacity and try to change a little bit of that experience for others. To I would say people often refer to me as being compassionately blunt and saying things that they often wish they weren't hearing but know they need to hear, and to give them that space to trust that they can hold it and heal from it. And I think through my own iterative process, I've found my voice now in the channels and the avenues that I'm showing up to really support other people in that work. And now really trying to champion this idea of shame resilience, meaning how do we create a life where we can work with our shame rather than be controlled by or spend our life trying to avoid it?
That is a huge one. And applaud you first for the journey that you went through in such a short period of time. So not even really being able to be a child, right? So
Yeah.
you talk about part of that shame that you feel, and as a coach, I know when we talk about that inner child, the fear that she had, the shame that she had, the
Hmm.
you can see where that unworthiness came from. And to have experienced that in such a young age, and then have this vision, because of course I often talk about it, right? My parents loved me. I know they did, but they had their own stuff they were dealing with. And so it was put on the smile, never let people know what's going on. We don't want to talk about family issues to anybody outside of the family. And so you have this fictitious belief of what life needs to look like. And to your point, the house with the picket fence, you're going to be a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
right? You start to think that I'm going to be okay, or I'm going to enjoy life once I've achieved that. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
is something that so many people do. And I hear from so many of my clients around, I'll be happy when, as opposed to in the moment. And a lot of that is shame driven or fear driven. So yeah, like first and foremost, what a life that you've had to live in such a short period of time. But let's shift and you talk a little bit about shame resilience, because there were so
Mm-hmm.
many golden nuggets in what you just said. And
Mm-hmm.
I encourage listeners to go back and pull out the words that Kyira was just talking about, because we all experience it and life is a journey, right? So you talk about shame resilience, and when we think about it, tell me a little bit about how, if we're thinking like today, this is about today's balanced leader, and I always say leaders are leaders of people and leaders of self. But how
Mm-hmm.
can leaders cultivate that shame resilience in themselves and their teams and create that culture where vulnerability is seen as a strength rather than a weakness? Because people talk about it, but talk is cheap, right? So how could we
Mm-hmm.
action that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about how, so shame, the word shame kind of blew up when Brene Brown's TED Talk blew up, and then everybody started talking about it. And I mean, we've seen this in the corporate world. We've seen this in small companies. There's, what's your employee wellness and what's this and what's the culture and our mission? And I think kind of similarly, talk only gets you so far. And I think shame became kind of a buzzword where everyone's like, shame and burnout. And we're all talking about this. But one of the things that I think we have to do is we're so quick in our culture. And obviously, we can really only speak to Canada, the US, based on our experiences, but it's mirrored in many other locations throughout the world. We live in such a hustle culture that anytime we hear anything, shame, burnout, stress, conflict, it's fix it,
Anxiety. Yeah.
solve it, put and that's the band-aid. So when you think about companies, when you think about settings, if anyone were to, whether you're in a leadership role or not, if you are working in a company and you were to think about any sort of tension point and how it's resolved, quite typically it's, well, here's the fix, here's what we're doing. There's not an open dialogue, there's not a discussion, there's not space to just take a burnout day or week or whatever it is. It's, well, here's this program, but also if you enroll in this hour-long program, you're going to have to make up the time elsewhere. And we're going to tell you that we want you to take your lunch breaks, but your boss is actually never taking a lunch break and they're staying late. So the subliminal message is if you want to get ahead, then you have to give up your lunch break. Or we're giving you these programs, and I've seen this numerous times where it's supposed to be for everybody, but the only people that show up are the quote unquote lower end employees. So leadership isn't coming to this burnout training, which suggests they're fine. The problem is you. So I think the first thing that we have to do in general is to recognize that shame is a human experience. It doesn't matter if you are a president, vice president, if you're a C-suite exec, you have shame because you're a human existing in today's world. You have a belief on some level that you are unworthy and not good enough of love, connection, and belonging. And you have developed a response system, which is shame, to say, if I do this, I will be good enough. If I can become the president, if I can become the lead on this project, if I can be, I think about somebody that is trying to make partner at a law firm or trying to secure some place in some special project, then I'm going to feel good enough. And we do this in other areas too. But if we're just putting that work piece on, recognize that likely some of what's driven you as a leader to get to where you're going is the belief that you have to do this to be allowed in the room. And you're driven by this idea that if you're not climbing, if you're not achieving, if you're not looking for the next thing, you're failing or flailing, or people are going to think less of you. And so if you can first do that and recognize that all of us have some sort of rule book that is telling us that we have to look and act and secure certain things to be good enough, then we're all on an even platform. It's not how do you manage your employees to feel better. It's how do we as a collective shift the culture to feel better. And then I think the work is really around, okay, So if shame is the belief of not being good enough, it's recognizing that, and this is where it's really hard. Most of what you're doing is not an emergency. And I say that being married to an emergency medicine physician. You don't fucking need a response to your email today. You could wait. You don't have to stay another hour for this meeting. The meeting probably didn't even need to happen. You could have all solved it in a 2-minute exchange over email. And so it's this realization that we've created such an urgency that we've dismissed sort of our humanity in it. Sometimes you need a break.
Yep.
Sometimes you need a day off. Sometimes coming in at 10 would make you a more productive employee than if you came in at 8. And so what does that look like to start to have conversations around, gosh, you know what? I noticed you're taking on a lot. What is it that's driving you to say yes to every project? And realizing that sometimes people are saying yes because they believe if they say no, that they are immediately going to lose their standing. They're doing it out of fear, not because they want to. What happens if you established a culture and said, you know what? Everybody is taking a lunch break. Nobody is taking a meeting, including me, after 4 o'clock. Or you know what? Before you can put a meeting on someone else's schedule, here's the 3 questions I want you to ask yourself to decide if we really need a meeting or if it could be solved another way. Instead, we just sort of stay with what we know and we continue in that sort of urgency factor. And so I think to summarize it back up for people, first, it's recognizing we all have shame, regardless of where you place yourself in that sort of spectrum of leadership. Everybody has it. And if you don't put yourself in the community of change, you just see it as a problem to solve with other people, you are inadvertently going to perpetuate that hustle culture and the quick fix instead of saying, we need to pause. We need to be willing to not see production and output over process and people and actually have some conversations about what sustainable solutions look like to not just keep people right on the brink of burnout and give you a day off every once in a while and tell you to come back and be fine, but instead create systems where you're not constantly in that position where you have to make a choice between your mental health and your livelihood.
I applaud you. You've said it more succinctly and boldly than I have in the past because I also believe, and I've had some clients, and I'll give you an example because I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is when somebody comes to me and they're asking me for something I need, they take it on, right? I always used to say, listen, it's not yours to take on, just like negative energy is not yours to take on. We can show empathy, we can show compassion, we can show love, we can guide them, we can give them tools. They
Mm-hmm.
are responsible for their thing. And
Yep.
I've actually had leaders say to me, well, that's easy for you to say, but you don't understand. If I don't go do this, then it's not going to get done. And I would love
Mm-hmm.
to hear what your response is to people like that.
I mean, so what that tells me is likely they're in a tangled web of it's less about helping that individual and more about protecting themselves because they're afraid if they don't deliver, then their leader, their supervisor, they are going to be in a position and they have put themselves in that trap where it is all about sort of sink or swim for every individual person. And then if somebody's not doing something, it would feel like a luxury to even stop and say, I'm noticing that this isn't happening. I'm noticing a change in your work structure. I'm noticing your deliverables look different. What's going on? How can I support you? Or how do I let the ball drop and then hold them accountable? Instead, it's this protective, borderline feral reaction of, I just have to fix it as quickly as possible to make sure I am not at risk. And so I think that the question I would ask first is, okay, and then what? What happens if it doesn't get done? And I would go through what I call the vertical descent to get all the way down to the bottom of what is your core fear. And typically, my guess is the core fear is how it's going to reflect on them. And that's not to say that they don't care about their employees. It's to say that they are in such a state of scarcity that they don't have the capacity. Because when your fear brain is turned on, it's a totally different part of your brain.
Yeah.
You can't practice empathy and support and rational thinking for another person when you're in a state of fear. You're
Right.
just vigilant. And so I think helping them understand that and then to really think about there's really then 2 project buckets. First is to think about how to manage people and to be a supportive leader, which is really recognizing that you can't be the hardest working person in the room for their success. I've struggled with this as a therapist, and I'm sitting in the room and I've had supervisors remind me, You are not responsible for your client's success. They are.
That's right.
You have an ethical responsibility and show up and put the work in, but you can't be the hardest working person in the room. They have to be.
Yes.
But then it's recognizing that there's an accountability piece. And how do you create supportive accountability and boundary setting? But you can't do that if you're afraid, and this is project number two, that everything is going to fall on you. And so I think the second part of it is to really help break down organizational chart and responsibility, provide some validation. Of course, you feel this way. You're in a system and a structure that says that you are responsible for everyone, and responsibility seems like maybe the definition got a little confusing along the way. And we're not actually really understanding what that looks like to be a leader. Instead, what we're essentially saying is we're going to give you 10 people who may or may not do the work. So you're actually responsible for 10 people's jobs. That's what leadership is. And when there's no training around that, there's no support around that, there's no question asking, only reactions, that feels unsafe. And so I think the second thing I would say to that client is it sounds like you don't feel safe in your position unless everything is done at X rate. Talk to me about that. What needs to happen there? And then we just peel back the layers. And maybe it's boundary setting, maybe it's some reflection, maybe it's self induced scarcity. We don't know. But starting to peel that back to figure out what is creating that, how much of that is self-imposed and how much of that is community or collective driven based on the company, and what do we want to do about that once we get clear on it?
Yeah, and love that because I'm just thinking, and I know what the answer is going to be,
Mhm.
but I love the idea of looking at scarcity as well
Mm.
because people are not necessarily always people pleasers, but they may be afraid to your point, to lose their job. They may be afraid to take action. Maybe the 10 people they inherited, they would rather have three of the eight because
Mhm.
the rest have been, and I hate to say, have gotten away with not doing much in
Mhm.
the past, but haven't been held accountable to complete the job as they were hired for. And as a such, now you feel like you're okay, well, now I'm stuck because now I have to make this work. So I end up doing it for them.
And not necessarily pausing to go. So I'm thinking about a big company around here where I have both clients and friends that work for this company. Not only have they spent the last two, almost 3 years going through significant rounds of layoffs where everybody is petrified they're going to lose their job, but they're constantly being reorganized or reorged. So then you're like, I just inherited this team and you haven't even given us any space to get to know each other. Like,
Yeah.
this is like one of those reality TV shows of like a blind date to marriage in 24 hours. Like, we don't even know each other.
No
I don't
integration.
even
Yeah.
know. And I think that's the other part is there's a collective experience that's happened in the last few years that I think we also haven't given much credit to, where, you know what, maybe one of your employees did deliver constantly at that level and they're burnt out
Yeah.
because over time there were layoffs and reorgs. Then what often happens and is the source of a lot of large company issues, which we can't solve one-on-one with a client, it is a much bigger thing, but it's that the company, and again, that's this large ambiguous body, has made the individual responsible for a lack of resources, funding, and then again, ultimately scarcity. So your team laid off 4 people. That is a company problem, not a you problem to pick up the slack for those 4 people. But that's where I think some of the issues come into be. And then if we're 7 legs down the road, now your client comes in and is like, well, my person isn't doing their job. I either have to do it for them or I get fired. What do I do? Well, yeah, maybe they're not doing their job, but maybe also they're fucking burnt out because nobody has given a break and we don't even know if that's an appropriate job for them to be doing in the first place. So I think it's a chicken and an egg issue, but I think the ultimate root that I think is keeping people stuck is the belief that we have to move at such a pace that we don't have the luxury of asking why
Mhm.
and then sitting with the answers to those questions.
Agreed. Agreed. And I think sometimes we forget to put the right stakeholders at the table when we're making
Mm,
changes.
so
Um,
true.
yeah, that came up while you were talking about that because I recall times where companies that I've worked for, there was always a shift in priority,
Hmm.
but the stakeholders are never a part of that. And so you're left wondering, well, this project that I was now working on, is it still a go? Is it thrown out
Right?
the window? Like, what are we doing with it? Or am I doing it plus X, Y, and Z now as well?
Yeah.
To your point, which will lead to burnout. Because if I've seen a bunch of reorgs, chances are I'm probably not going to raise a lot of questions because I'm fearful that I'm going to be the next one by doing that.
Right. Right. Well, and I
Yeah.
think too, I go back to, I forget why I was having this conversation with somebody. I think we were talking about maybe like our morals and our values, but the idea that it's a lot easier to steal from Target than it would be from an art vendor at a fair where the maker is right in front of you.
Yeah.
And I used to work at the state level for a nonprofit. So there were local chapters, the state organization, and then a national organization. And this was a thing that I struggled with. My job was basically I was the connector between the national and the local level. And so one of the things that would happen is I would hear these things come down from above, and I'm supposed to relay it to these individual affiliates. And it is not the best choice to support the mission or to support the affiliates. So then I'd have to go back up and ask questions, or I felt stuck and I have no say. But what happens is it's like the Target versus, or whatever large company you want, versus the individual vendor. When you're working in a system that gets so big, we forget. It's like when we start to say, well, they did this, leadership says this. There's this collective voice that basically removes the human to human connection. So then the individual starts to feel like a cog in a machine, that they don't matter, but there also doesn't seem to be a physical person that they could connect to where they even feel like change could happen. And so I think a big part of it is having to figure out how you can develop these large scale companies where we don't lose the aspect of community.
Mhm.
And that takes a pretty significant culture change from the bottom all the way to the top and everywhere in between.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, and I've worked for both. So get
Hmm.
exactly what you mean by that. Kira, let's shift a little bit. You talked about boundary setting, and I'm a big
Hmm.
supporter of that. And that's something I love helping my clients with because I think boundaries can be scary. You talked about values. What is
Hmm.
important to you, what your values are, what you stand for, and create boundaries, and then communicate them in an effective way. They can really make life so much easier. So, what do you think some of the key signs that someone needs to set boundaries? And if thinking about our leader audience, or what are effective ways that you would say that they could communicate and enforce them without feeling guilty? Because I think a lot of times people feel guilty about,
Hmm.
now I'm creating this boundary because all of a sudden now there's this need. So now I have
Hmm.
to create this boundary, but I'm almost fearful to communicate it because I know I'm going to potentially get some backlash on it.
Yeah, I think that there's kind of some inner work to be done first, which is again asking that question of why, like, why don't you want to set the boundary? What are you afraid of? What do you think is going to happen in those moments? Again, if we're talking about someone that's like, well, I'm afraid if I don't take a lunch break, or if I take a lunch break, if I don't go to that meeting, if I say I'm going to leave every day by 4, so I'm not late constantly to pick up my kid from school, then I'm not going to be seen as a team player. Then my job could be on the line. I feel like I'm competing. That's a very different route than, and maybe there's like a reality to it, to if it's their internal story. And so I think first the reflection has to be, what's the source of your distress around setting a boundary? And for some of us, it has nothing to do with this workplace. I mean, you could drop us into any workplace, in any setting, in any friendship, partnership, whatever, and we're going to be afraid to set the boundary. And that oftentimes has a lot to do with our inability to make space for ourselves and those around us. And so when I think about me growing up, being that yes person, saying yes to everything, constantly taking on stuff that wasn't mine to take on, sometimes the behavior, being the person to say yes and to do it is actually really positive for me and it aligns with my values. Sometimes I'm doing it out of shame. And so I think the internal processing is first, why am I afraid to set this boundary? What is the like fear response? What's the distress that's coming up for me? And sorting through that to recognize maybe there are some realities. Maybe you saw a coworker that set some boundaries and then they were seen, as not being a team player. They were communicated to in a certain way and then they were let go in the last round of firing. And that would then shift the conversation to, it doesn't sound like you're in a healthy work environment. What do we want to do to respond to that? So the avenue I would take people with there is, then what emotional boundaries do we need to set? What radical acceptance boundaries do we have to set? That it seems like basically the choice is either don't take care of yourself and potentially stay, but maybe probably not, or take care of yourself and potentially stay, but maybe probably not. So what do you want to do with that? And really having that conversation. Most people, I think, that struggle with setting boundaries, it's more likely an internal fear that they have. It's not rooted to anything they have data around it, or maybe they have a couple points of data, but it's this, I'm going to let people down. They're going to be mad at me. They're going to think these things. And a lot of that is a projection of their internal fears on other people. And so I think about, if we're going to set our boundaries, two things are true. One, there's no way you're going to feel comfortable with it because you don't have practice in it. It's new. There's my daughter's learning how to ride a pedal bike right now. She went from a balance bike to a pedal bike, no training wheels. There's zero way that your brain's going to be comfortable with it because it doesn't have familiarity yet. So I think the first is radical acceptance. You cannot get to a point where it doesn't feel risky and scary to do it because it's new. That's actually a sign that your brain is healthily functioning, that you feel that. But then I think the second part is starting to recognize, okay, so how you're responding to that distress is the key piece. And so starting to think about, other people are going to be disappointed. If you've always been the person that said yes, if you've always been the person that stayed late, if you've always been the person that's available, and suddenly you're not, of course they're going to be disappointed. And is that yours to take on?
Right.
No. That is theirs. That is completely okay. If your boss asks you to take on a project and you are incapable of taking that on and delivering at the level that feels right to you and your values, and you say no, they have every right to be disappointed. That doesn't mean that you messed up. That doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. Typically, that point right there, when someone feels that and they take responsibility for other people's emotions, that's the moment they erode the boundary and they walk it back. Just kidding. Well, I'll meet with you. I'll take this one time. I won't take a lunch. And then that one time that they schedule a meeting over lunch becomes they never take a lunch break again. And then it feels even harder. And so then in that, it's learning how to tolerate the distress around other people's disappointment and the stories you're crafting around that disappointment. Because if the only way that you can maintain your job is to never set a boundary for yourself, the only way that you can be seen as a team player is to have zero part of you on the team because your only job is to erode yourself for everyone else, then you're in a toxic relationship. You are in an abusive relationship and it's not healthy. And I think that's ultimately the point. And so to loop back to your initial point, I would say, and I have a handout that we can put in the show notes for people, that is a distress tolerance. Basically, it's a subjective units of distress worksheet. So if you think about anything, maybe your initial reaction when you're going to set a boundary is you're anxious. Okay, well, you experience your anxiety on a 0 to 10 scale. It's learning what you can do to help manage your anxiety at those levels so that it doesn't stop you from the ultimate thing that you're doing. So if we think about that, if it's, okay, well, gosh, my anxiety is at like a 4. If I think about saying no to this meeting because I don't really need to be there, but I do need to pick up my kid and I can't afford to pay for aftercare again. And so I'm going to say no and I'm going to decline the meeting. Okay, I'm at like a 4. Well, we do some of that internal work around, it is okay to set that meeting or to say no to that meeting. It's okay to do this. But again, my brain's not going to feel that. What helps me? Sometimes it's taking a few deep breaths. Sometimes it's re-anchoring your story on something more than your job. Sometimes it is physical things, like we know that the power of cold water to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. Maybe it's taking a sip of cold water right before I hit that decline button. Maybe it's following up with an email that says, I really want to be a part of XYZ conversation. This is an unavoidable circumstance. I need to pick up my kid. Please loop me in if there's something that you would like some additional feedback and support on. So you're satisfying that. Whatever that looks like, but getting clear on some of those distress tolerance responses, because ultimately the goal is, again, you're not going to feel good. It's helping you not go to a state of reactivity and then backtracking it and learning to tolerate the distress while your brain is learning a new pattern of operating.
I love that. Yes, and I've to have come up with some, at least I can speak to it. I know I was there at some point in time, right? Where I
Hmm.
didn't decline the meeting because how would that look on me? I'm the only one not attending. What am I missing? Now I'm
Hmm.
out of the loop, right? Like you tell yourself so many stories to try and
Hmm.
justify why you should say yes.
Hmm.
And I think even just that walk and talk, like if you can, sometimes walking and talking it through and getting out, to your point, you go down to the core of what truly is bothering you. So you start
Yeah.
talking about what it is. You get to where you really realize what it is. For
Hmm.
me, it was around that people pleasing. And
Hmm.
so then it was, okay, so now I get to work with that. Or if it's, how does it fit and align with my values? So
Yeah.
understanding that and then taking it and kind of going, the flip side of the positive and then working yourself back up around,
Hmm.
I don't need to attend that meeting because I have enough information that I have to do what my portion is to do. Somebody
Yeah.
else will keep me in the loop if blah blah, right? So that all of a sudden you're not jeopardizing in your example picking up your child or having to pay that extra fee because you've left them at daycare too long. There are ways, but I think we get so fearful. That fear is so strong sometimes that it can just pull us in, and then we feel like we're drowning and it's kind of a sink or swim, which it never is. That's to your point, when we need to step back, take a look at it and find ways to kind of harness it and quiet it down a little bit, because I think once you start doing it a couple of times, you start to get really good at it where you can start to evaluate things quicker because
Right.
now your brain is thinking differently. You're almost rewiring your brain a bit.
Well, and part of it, I think, too, is shifting away from so many of us confuse our identity with what we do. And so, even the idea of leadership, every one of us listening to this, a part of these conversations would have a different definition of what a good leader looks like. There'd probably be some overlap, but what your specific position at that job is not your identity. You didn't become a leader to be that specific position. There's something about the values that's connected to it. There's something about the impact that you can have. And so I think a big part of it is to recognize in those moments, if you're not setting a boundary because you're afraid of the output, that is shame. If you're not setting the boundary because ultimately it feels like it's not right for your values, okay, then it's a values driven piece. And so the two things that I think about in those moments is one, would the rule be the same for everybody else?
Mm.
Would, if anybody else needed to go pick up their kid and they were in this position, would I have the same expectation that they pay for aftercare and they stick around for this meeting? If the answer is no, it's a pretty high likelihood that this is a shame driven rule.
Yeah.
And then the second question is, am I making this choice out of a place of resentment, reactivity? Am I trying to hurt or harm the team or another individual? No, I'm just trying to take care of myself. So at the end of the day, it's also being able to stop putting everybody else's reactions over that and then write a story to say, I wasn't being hurtful or harmful. Me not doing, saying yes to this thing, I'm not hurting anybody. I'm protecting me. I'm afraid I'm hurting somebody and I'm making their emotional reaction the most important thing. But in reality, this is a job. I'm not their therapist. I'm not their partner. It's not my job to make sure that they are happy or that they, if and I'm thinking about maybe with your
Oh,
own boss, that they are setting their own boundaries with their bosses in the same way. It's saying, okay, if the rule is not the same for everyone, if I don't have the same basic belief and value that this is what it looks like to be a part of the team for everybody included, that's shame driven. And then again, am I coming at it from a place to try to hurt, harm anyone else around me or the collective mission, or am I just trying to take care of myself? Those two questions alone, if we were to just pause and ask ourselves those things before we either said yes or no or set a boundary, would change the insight. You might still stay,
right.
but at least you understand that you're staying out of shame, not because it ultimately makes you a better employee or a better leader. You're staying because you have some stuff you need to work through. And then hopefully you take the invitation to work on it. In the meantime, you're probably still going to stay and not set the boundaries, but at least it's recognizing that. And I think if we don't shift that perspective, we're all going to constantly keep reinforcing each other's shame in a way that none of us are going to be able to go to bed without checking our email 10 more times because we're afraid we're going to miss something and what's going to happen. Or we're all going to erode our lunches and we're all going to constantly have binge eating concerns and intuitive eating problems and health issues, and we're going to have poor sleep and chronic illness because we've all decided that it's okay to not take care of our bodies for the good of some mission that nobody's even clear on anymore, because we're all just doing it because we're afraid that we're going to be seen as screwing up if we don't.
Wow. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. I don't know what else to say to that. And I think too, if you're the first person to start those questions, if you're the first person to start to change the way you show up, it actually starts to transform the culture because other people, guaranteed there are other people out there that are feeling the exact same way, have been afraid and haven't gotten to that point to be able to ask those two questions to fight it for themselves. And yes, I like I said, I don't know what else to say to that.
Well, and in you saying that too, I think about two things. So one is the realization that, again, we alluded to it before, but let's say that you are in a leadership role and you're like, okay, I do want to change some of the cultural pieces for myself and for my team because I want everyone to feel supported and I want to get rid of this shame. I want to get rid of some of this urgency. If at the end of the day, you are fired for trying to create a healthier workplace environment, that's not you. You are not the problem. But again, if your whole aspect is like, I have to be everything for everyone, take care of everything, I have to keep the job, I have to keep excelling. If that's the ultimate guiding force, then you're stuck in a cycle of shame that is playing very well into this abusive relationship. And so I think one, recognizing I don't want to say that everybody should just say screw it and just roll the dice on getting fired. That's not my position, but recognizing that if you can't set a boundary without trusting that you are allowed to do that, it is an unhealthy relationship. And so if you do this and something happens, you get scolded, people push back on you, that doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're changing the system. And so it's getting to a place you can feel comfortable with that. I think the second thing I think about is when I did work for that nonprofit, when I was at the state level, I had a boss who, gosh, I was maybe only a month into my job. And she called me into her office one day, and I was still very much in my I need to be perfect. I need everybody to think I'm the best employee ever position. Where she said, I've noticed that you're on your email a lot when you're at home. I said, yeah, I'm just, trying to keep up with things. I forget exactly what the conversation was. This was, 15 years ago at this point. But essentially, I was thinking she's going to say, I'm not keeping up with things. I'm not taking enough on. And the ultimate conversation was, I don't want you working when it's not work time. I was like, but I'm salaried, which also most people in a salaried position are like 40 hours is not real. That's a thing that we used to believe. You have to give at least 50 to 60, and you should be checking your email multiple times from home. You should be available on your phone. You have to have all, the email, the WhatsApp, the chats, all has to be on your phone so people can access you. And she was very clear with me that I was going to be written up if I worked outside of my hours. Because one of the things, now again, I was working in a mental health company, so there was a little bit more of an emphasis on that.
Yeah.
But it was, how are we modeling taking care of our own mental health to the people that we work with and to each other if we are constantly eroding our boundaries? And one of the things that I started paying attention to was that she never answered an email when she was not in the office. She ended up taking maternity leave about a year and a half after that. When she was on maternity leave, she had very clear expectations around when she would and she would not be responding to things, what her transition to work was going to look like. Never did she erode those boundaries. And not for a second did anybody question her work ethic. Nobody ever thought that she wasn't completely invested and cared about things. She just had incredibly good boundaries. Now, her as the leader, the rest of us followed suit. It was hard for me. We had to have a few more conversations around what that looked like. But man, did that make a difference. And did I start to understand that when I was able to create those boundaries, what I did in my 40 hours was way more effective than what I had been doing in 60 hours. But I hadn't yet had any support and a reminder and then reinforcement that that could be the case. And so I do think, just to showcase to somebody that if a leader can be bold enough to do that, that has an effect. And it makes a difference. And it changed the way that when I became a leader in different ways, how I approached things for people, because I thought about that. And I thought about the fact that everything she said to me, she stood by and she did herself. I felt okay when I had to say no. I also felt okay when I said yes then, because I knew that I was doing it for reasons that she would support. And if I said yes on something that was not good for me and my mental health or was pushing my boundary, I knew she wouldn't support it and she would question it. And that helped me develop the confidence as well.
So what a great leader to have as a mentor,
Mm-hmm.
to teach you in that. And I think I want to reiterate to the leaders, what you said about you become more productive in the 40 hours that you're there than in the
Mm-hmm.
60 hours. And it's so true because you get caught in that loop of having to clear out your inbox, answer to everybody. There's always one more thing that needs to be doing. I need to finish my expense report. I need to,
Yep.
right? Whatever that one thing is. But you're so right when you, and I learned this, you're so right. You said it, you hit the nail on the head. You are way more productive in your 40 hours than
Yeah.
you are in your 60. It's,
Well,
yeah.
and think about the fact that whether you're working 40 hours, 60 hours, or 80 hours, you're still going to come back to there's not enough time.
Oh,
Because the reality is there's not enough time to do everything. Time is a scarce resource.
yeah.
So instead of allowing it to be like gas in an enclosed container that just takes up all the space it can, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to just keep buying a bigger container, it's going to keep expanding. Make the container smaller. When you create that little bit of scarcity, you also rewire the way you think about your time. So you stop saying, well, I'll stay for that extra meeting. I'll take this on. You're much clearer about your yeses and your nos. And some of that also comes down to, I'll have to find the episode so you can put it in the show notes. But there was a person that went on the Tim Ferriss podcast years ago, and she does corporate leadership work, and she talks about fun in corporate settings and really helping people understand that productivity gets stifled when we are so output focused and how to create more of that. And so I'm blanking on her name and I hate that, but it'll be in the show notes because I'll find it. So we'll all be able to
Thank
recall
you.
it later. But one of the things that she talked about was when we can do that, we can also create more of an awareness around our body intelligence and our emotional intelligence to feel better about when we say yes and when we say no.
Yeah.
And if we can create a little bit more space, if you, instead of just saying, well, I can say yes to everything and the rest of my life suffers, you go, no, I actually only have 5 yeses I can give. So I need to be more strategic about that. When I can do that and I can reframe it again around this is for the good of the work environment, you get a lot clearer and more productive in what you're doing overall. And your employees will feel safer in that too. Like, gosh, you only have so much work time. If you're taking 10 hours of meetings a day, you're in the negative. You're in the red. You got no time to do your actual projects. How is that in service of our mission and our collective goal? It's not. So we need to make your container smaller. You only get to say yes 2 times a day to meetings. The rest of those coins have to go to other things, or else you're never going to be able to follow through. And then you are going to come from that place of shame and scarcity, in which case, not just you, but the entire team is going to suffer because shame is like glitter. And we're going to reinforce that. And then we can't make a change in the culture.
Yes. Yes. As you were saying that too, I was thinking about, I remember the days when I looked at my calendar and I literally said, I have meetings back to back. I don't know when I'm going to do my work. And
Mm-hmm.
then take a step back because now, I do a lot of intuitive work. I do a lot of mind, body, spirit work. I can actually sit there now and I can look at my calendar and say, okay, to your point, what are the things that need to get done in the 40 hours that
Mm-hmm.
are going to meet the objectives of my business, meet the goals, be of service, and what are the things that are just the nice to do's that are that
Mm-hmm.
you really don't need to be doing. And when you look at your calendar that way, and now sometimes I even color code things like, okay, well,
Mm-hmm.
this would be kind of a cool meeting to attend or a podcast to listen to, but it's
Yep.
not necessary. And so
Yep.
I put it in a different color because all the other things must be done before I do something like
Mm-hmm.
that. It
Mm-hmm.
really changes how you set up the structure of your day. Now I look at it and then a non-negotiable, and I talk about one of my episodes about non-negotiables. And one of my
Mm-hmm.
non-negotiables to this day is I wake up in the morning while I'm stretching in bed, I'm setting my intentions for the day of how I want the day to go, what kind of
Hmm.
feeling I want to have into the day so that I'm starting in that positive energy. And then the first thing I'm doing is I'm having my quiet time. I'm going for a walk, or I'm doing my meditation or my restorative yoga, because
Yep.
those are my non-negotiables before I even start my day. And I
Yep.
love how you talk about sometimes the person who shows up at 10 o'clock in the morning is the most productive person, because that's when they need to start. They're so unproductive between 8 and 10. Maybe something's going on. Maybe they need to hit reset for themselves to be able to
Right.
be at their best selves. And why we frame society as it must be this now, just to be honest, drives me crazy. And I don't
Hmm.
adhere to it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
Well, and I think a lot about when I am constantly rushed out the door. So my daughter's 4.5. If I feel like I haven't been able to show up for her in the ways that I want to because there's this urgency, it's like, well, let's go, let's get your shoes on, let's do this. One, what am I teaching her? But two, when I would start in any sort of environment like that, I'd spend the first 45 minutes or an hour ruminating on being a shitty mom, not doing my job well. So it was also realizing I'm not doing myself a favor because the worlds are going to actually blend more. And so the rule of thumb that I think about now in everything in my life is my husband used to joke, nothing good happens after midnight. I mean, we met when we were in our early 20s when staying out past 9 o'clock felt like a good idea. And now I'm like, nine is late and I should have already been asleep. And so the idea of if you would go out to a bar, you'd go to a party, there's just no point in staying out past midnight. Like, go home. You don't need to close the bars down, go home. And I think about that with work. I think about that with life, with it, whether it's time with friends, time with my daughter. Sometimes we are just milking something to the point that we leave just burnt out. What would it look like if you ended your workday excited that you get to come back tomorrow? Instead of trying to get it all done and you've gone past that point of exhaustion. Anyone that has ever been around a toddler, even if you don't have kids, there's a point that they cross where there's no return. You should have gone home an hour earlier.
Yeah.
You missed the cues. Then bedtime's going to be great and everybody can have a lovely rest of the night. There's a point if you don't hit that, though, you've lost it. And so realizing for us, it's that piece of we need to stop expecting that time can just be expanded. Instead, it's, what if you left before you wanted to? What if you still had that, like, oh, I'm actually kind of excited about this project, or I'm excited to come back tomorrow and respond to that email. I'm excited to check in with this team about this instead of just, I have to do this, I have to stay, or we're giving all of our control and power to the company rather than the choice of, I get to do this, I get to show up, and I'm going to be excited about this thing because I'm going to make it work in my terms. And then when I trust my values, I realize I'm actually a really good employee and I am going to show up and put the work in. And I'm not going to love everything, but I'm not going to constantly be dragging my feet to doing it because I feel like I have to and I have no choice or onus or control. And that shift, that's the positive effect I think you're talking about that ripples through the company. That's going to change the way that we show up because some of the work is still going to suck, like the way that I view parenting now versus the way I did before I did some of that internal reframing. Sometimes being a parent really sucks. I love my daughter. I will always be there for her, but there are days that I wish I could just forget I could know she's going to be safe. And then I could just forget for like an hour that I'm a parent just to take a breath. And if we don't get to that place where we just reframe it and we go, your job is still going to suck sometimes. Point blank, we're still all coming out of trauma, post COVID world. Most people are downsizing. Most people are inundated with way too much to do. We are still in that hustle culture mentality. You're going to feel it, but you get to reframe your relationship with it.
I've often used the I get to as opposed to I
Mm-hmm.
have to. It reminded me of a conversation that I had with a former colleague around team meetings. Oh, I have to do this team meeting. And I was like, you know what? I so admire my team. Like, even to this day, the team that I had, I
Mm-hmm.
get to have a meeting with them. We
Yeah.
get to brainstorm ideas. We get to talk about some of the challenges we're having, and we get to make a difference as opposed to I have to. Because even just that feel of, oh, I have to do this, I have to find a
Yep.
solution, I have to, like, it just weighs you down. It just bogs you in your mind, and you can't function or be productive in that kind of a mindset when, to your point, when you're excited and you have that mentality of I get to do this, it's beautiful. Like even if you're in the customer service world, I get to support this person or help this person or serve this person that is standing or sitting in front of me, because it's an experience that you're both having. And when you
Hmm.
do that, the experience is beautiful. And trust me, that give receive just
Yeah.
is beautiful in itself, and it becomes memorable.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to talk a little bit, and I'm trying to be sensitive to the time because I could talk to you for hours. So I'd love to get your thought on negative self-talk, because negative self-talk I
Mm.
feel is huge. It's all around us. In my community, I often remind them of how much more loving, forgiving, and passionate to others we can be, but yet we beat ourselves up all the time.
Hmm.
What
Hmm.
strategies do you recommend for combating that negative self-talk, especially with the turmoil that is in this world today? Because I know you guys are going into elections this year, we're going into
Hmm.
elections next year. What's your recommendation for negative self-talk?
I think there's two things for us to think about. So the first being, whenever we start to tell ourselves something, typically our negative self talk, if we really boil it down, is a subjective interpretation about ourselves. It's not fact, but it feels like it's fact because we've been telling ourselves this for so long. So, the example being that you leave the work meeting or you leave a party and you're ruminating the whole time on the drive home, going, I shouldn't have said that. That person's annoyed at me. I did X, Y, and Z. You don't actually have proof, but you've written the story so strongly that you've convinced yourself that it's true. So, most negative self talk is a subjective interpretation that's ultimately rooted to shame and a core belief. So, a lot of the times, what I'll ask people to do is to really get at both where's that coming from? Because you've likely been believing these things about yourself for a really long time. So, is it even true that Sarah looked at you a certain way, or is it that anybody could have looked in any type of way and you were going to feel that way? And tell me where else you felt it.
Mhm.
But the question that I'll ask people to really think about, it's Byron Katie's work, is that is it true? Is it absolutely 100% objectionably true? Okay. If not, what are some other alternatives? And this is where I'll kind of build on what she's done. What else might that be? What else could be going on? And a big part of that is decentering ourselves from the story. Our shame and our ego loves to make us be the problem. And so there's something I talk a lot about, the drama triangle, which is basically we are constantly, when we're in a state of shame, either playing the hero, which is that I have to be everything for everyone. It's my responsibility all the time. The villain, if something goes wrong, it's my fault, which is the client example you gave earlier, or the victim. No one ever shows up for me. No one's ever there. It's always on me. Nobody cares. And we're just basically rotating through those three pieces. And so starting to think about, well, what would be a story if you weren't the center of it? Maybe her cat died. Maybe she woke up this morning and she wasn't feeling very good. Maybe she has a sick and aging parent and she's really scared about something that just happened. Maybe she's waiting for a call from her doctor. Maybe whatever those other stories are. And then we just start to build in the capacity that it might not be about us. You might still think at the end of that exercise it's about you, but what we're basically doing is trying to expand the story to say, we're not going to go there immediately. What are all the other possibilities? The other part about Byron Katie's work that is really fun is then to go, well, if I believe this to be true, how do I change? Who do I become? If I believe she doesn't like me, then what? Then I start to actually try to make up for it. I almost overdo it. I go out of my way to try to please her. I'll say yes to things or I'll avoid her at all costs. I don't want to talk. I won't look her in the eye. I won't talk to her. I will notice that I am not able to engage in the same, whatever that is. How do we change the way we show up? And are we okay with that? So I think just some thought exercises, some pausing. And I think the biggest thing is to realize that your brain might still go from A to B. What we're essentially trying to do in the beginning is to create a mindful pause to say, hey, wait a minute, before you get to B, let's just consider if you want to go to C, D, E, or F first. You might still choose B, but we're just trying to create some awareness. As you start to practice that more and more, you can start to say, how likely is that true? How likely is it that this is the case? And that takes time because in the beginning, the answer is going to be, it's 100% true. She looked at me that way. That's what it means. She's upset with me. I didn't deliver X, Y, and Z. But then I think the second thing that we have to get at is, okay, what if it was true? What if you were the world's worst employee?
Mhm.
What if your boss doesn't like you? Then what? and just start to play through that scenario. Oftentimes what we do when we're in a state of negative self-talk is we put a period at the end of that part of the story instead of a comma or a semicolon, and then move on. Okay, if your worst case came true, then what? Does your story end there? No. So we help start to build some distress tolerance and then you'd probably cry and you'd be really upset and you'd feel super uncomfortable. You might feel like you're in a state of depression for a while. You got fired from your job, whatever, keep kind of playing through the list. And then what? And you get them to the point where they take the step out of the hole. Again, we're not stopping the thought, we're not stopping the anxiety in the moment, but we're just starting to expand the brain's capacity to, one, think beyond that one thought, and then two, extend the story after that, even if that thought were true. So I know for the sake of time, we don't have the ability to break down all of this, but there are a couple worksheets that I have that I will send you. So one is really a thought analysis worksheet that I have that can help people start to break this down. I'll give you that so people can at least start the process. But I think the biggest thing is to recognize that typically when your thoughts are coming into play, what's your basis? What's the reality that you have? Is it your story, or do we actually have non-questionable, objectionable facts that if anybody came into the room, they would all agree with me that your boss hates you, not just that you think that your boss hates you?
Yes, I love that. That was a great way to do it, especially with your boss hating you. It's because it's such an extreme, right? Like you giggle
Yeah,
at it, kind of going, your boss hates you. Well, they don't hate you. They may not
right,
like elements of you or things that you
right.
do or say, but they don't hate you. That was great. Yeah. And I love Byron Katie's work. I often use the work and even with myself, because
Yeah.
sometimes we end up in that situation where we need to do the work. So thank you. I always ask my listeners one last question. If there was one thing in your life, one saying, one epiphany, one book, one transformation you went through that made a difference, what would you say that is for you?
I think the thing I've been marinating on right now, so I don't know if it is the most impactful, but I think right now it is the most resonant to me, is this idea. It's a quote from Bruce Lee that I am not here to meet everyone's expectations. And so it's really getting at the heart of radical acceptance and responsibility, that I need to stay in my zone of responsibility and empowerment and give people the space to be in theirs as well. And it's when we start taking responsibility to meet everybody else's expectations, or we put it on other people to meet all of ours, that we get lost in the shame and the chaos and the interpersonal distress that I think keeps many of us burnt out and struggling.
That's a really good one. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I'm also going to include your information. So your website is Adversity Rising. And if you're interested, Kyira has some great freebies that are available and resources on her website. But you can also get more information about her program that's called That Life, Adversity Rising. And yeah, it's got some great information in there. So thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast. It was absolutely a pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to today's Balanced Leader. If you want to go even deeper, then visit my website at carolinebarrett.com, find some free resources, and look at all the different ways that I can support you to become your best self. Remember, change begins with just one small step. It's those tiny actions that start you on the path to achieving your dreams and finding balance. And as always, life is an experience. So take a moment to enjoy the journey and appreciate the progress you make along the way. Until next time, keep taking those small steps, savor the journey, and lead with courage and authenticity. This is Caroline, reminding you to stay bold, stay balanced, and keep moving confidently towards your dreams. Thanks for tuning in to today's Balanced Leader. If you want to go even deeper, then visit my website at carolinebarrett.com, find some free resources, and look at all the different ways that I can support you to become your best self. Remember, change begins with just one small step. It's those tiny actions that start you on the path to achieving your dreams and finding balance. And as always, life is an experience. So take a moment to enjoy the journey and appreciate the progress you make along the way. Until next time, keep taking those small steps, savor the journey, and lead with courage and authenticity. This is Caroline reminding you to stay bold, stay balanced, and keep moving confidently towards your dreams.